Welcome back to the Dark Reading News Desk here at Black Hat USA. We're coming to you live from the Mandalay Bay Hotel, and I'm joined now by Gar O'Hara, Field CTO with Mimecast. Gar, thanks for joining us today on the news desk.
Great to be here.
We are talking about mitigating risk across complex environments. The adoption of hybrid work, of course, has only made the overall cyber risk bleed over now into business risk. This is maybe an unforeseen consequence of the whole work from home phenomenon. Let's start by talking about how advanced email and collaboration security solutions can help organizations more effectively reduce that risk. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I completely agree. We're never going back to the way it was before. And with what we see as hybrid or post-COVID working, and that sort of work surface that we need to protect, it's completely changed. We've seen a dramatic increase in the use of email for very obvious reasons. People aren't in the same office where they could have a conversation like this and work things out. So they're collaborating digitally. They're doing that on email. They're doing that on Slack and on Teams. And as a result, that sort of work surface has completely changed. And therefore, how you need to kind of protect that work has changed also. So that increase in digital kind of channels.
How do you see the cyber risk bleeding over into overall business risk? That's a curious but real phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that sort of increase of digital communications, the reality is where the data is being sort of communicated between the people involved in an organization, that's changed. Instead of us having a conversation, it's now on digital channels. Therefore, the risk is increased because the attackers will obviously go where that sort of stuff lives. So you're seeing that increased cyber risk. Now, the reality is for most organizations, the value of them, it sort of lives in the data, right? It's the secret sauce, it's the IP, it's those intangible assets that are the value of the overall sort of business organization, right? So that therefore, anything that's going to attack that or risk the data or the people or the communications obviously is sort of parlays into a risk to the business.
The whole work from home phenomenon notwithstanding, continuous evolution of the threat landscape contributes to greater complexity just as a normal course of business. Talk about the threats that keep CSOs up at night, and as a follow, what proactive steps they can take to help reduce this complexity and thereby also reduce risk.
Yeah, so there's really sort of two parts when I think about questions like that. The first is the actual threats themselves, and the complexity of those has increased. The sorts of things the average CISO needs to think about has kind of broadened. You see business email compromise, you see ransomware attacks, phishing attacks, credential harvesting, all the things that we're kind of familiar with. And in those kind of silos of attacks, they've actually gotten much more complex and sophisticated. The reconnaissance that it takes to do a business email compromise has increased. So CISOs are very, very well aware of that. But what you've seen as a result of that is a proliferation of solutions that try and kind of cater for all of these different attack surfaces or things that are happening. And I think what actually sometimes can keep CISOs awake is the fact that they now not just have the threats that are happening, but on the other side and internal to their organization, they've got this massively complex set of technical controls that they're trying to dial up, dial down, and is it configured correctly, is it working correctly? And as a vendor, look, we're seeing that pressure come to us where for many organizations that simplicity is what they're looking for, and they'll come to a vendor looking for best practice recommendations and ways to remove that complexity.
Well, there's certainly the internal threats, but
Yep.
Nobody wants to be the linchpin in that supply chain attack, do they? I mean, that's complexity on a different exponential scale.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And sort of when I think supply chain, I think digital supply chain. So downstream effects of a patch or an upgrade or open source libraries, but then also those trust relationships where things like business email compromise or impersonation come into play. And that's the bit where, protecting an organization's email and making sure that you're not the organization that either gets an impersonation attack or is the organization that is used in an impersonation attack. So things like DMARC come into play there, where you can actually lock down the domains that you own so that you can't be spoofed. So, there's a lot of different ways you can attack that problem.
I mean, it's fascinating that social engineering, like everything else, has gotten more automated.
Yep, it absolutely has, yeah. I mean, you see the evolution of things like AI and machine learning being used for social engineering. And on the flip side, organizations like ourselves, like Mimecast, are using AI and machine learning technologies in the back end to do things like social graphing, so we can start to understand things like reputation strength and relationship strength between maybe you and I as a sending pair in email, and being able to understand what good looks like, so then you can start to understand anomalies and do things about it.
Let's shift gears a little bit. Microsoft 365, Google Workspace are their own kinds of collaborative ecospheres, if you will.
Yep.
Can you talk a bit about the tools, technologies, and approaches that would best enable organizations to add layers of security to keep these ecospheres better protected?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think layers is exactly what we're talking about here. Pretty standard practices, layered security is going to give you a better outcome. Fair to say, Microsoft and Google, excellent productivity platforms, but traditional approach of a gateway solution, sitting out there doing the sort of heavy lifting of securing email before it ever gets to the productivity environment, that's a really good choice. We've just launched a product called Express here at Black Hat, and that's another way to deploy that same kind of technology approach. But back to your question about kind of simplicity, it's a way to do that, but using programmatic connections into that environment, so API connections, MX-less, gateway-less, and you get a deployment in 4 minutes rather than a traditional gateway, which can sometimes take weeks to do. So you get the that same outcome, but really it's about layering whatever the deployment option you choose, either MX-less or a traditional gateway approach.
What's your sense of the overall security with 365 or Workspace in terms of the security that they sort of come out of the package with? Are they checking basic boxes? Is the assumption that the end users will of course do the layering on top of that? How does that actually gin out?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question, and I would say that the productivity platforms tend to not be pure play security platforms. Like, that's not what they've traditionally done, and it's a hard thing to pivot into, is what I would say. So the way we would see it is layering a pure play security player on top of the M365 environment is really the best option for kind of securing those environments.
So what I'm hearing is basically all of us users are now in the business of layering our own security and on top of these collaborative tools.
To me, that is the best. Like, if you're looking for a good security outcome, I think that's where it lies. I would say there's different types of security strategies. There's ones that it's driven by security outcomes, and then there sometimes are ones that are driven by kind of financial decisions. And what you see there is sometimes a tendency for what I would consider to be over-consolidation into a single environment. And and we're all cybersecurity people here. We kind of get what that means. If you're in a single environment, generally that's a single point of failure, and it moves away from kind of diversifying risk into layered security approaches.
Can you take a little deeper cut at the actual layers that we're talking about here?
Yep.
You mentioned the product that you've introduced. What are the features and functions that at least are required of I don't know, just the basic connectivity and productivity and collaboration that we're all doing in this work from home era?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about collaboration, it's across communication, right? So I mean, any work surface that you're going to protect, it's people, it's communications, it's data, it's those three things. And when it comes to the communication side of things, and back to your question about complexity, you kind of want to be able to do security in a simple way, but across those channels. And then into like the sort of feature components, it's things like using AI and machine learning to understand patterns and surface things that are potentially risky. But we're big believers that you still need sort of static and dynamic content analysis. You can't go away from the things that we know work and work really, really well from a security efficacy perspective. So when you look at something like Express or Gateway, that are our two kind of options, the Gateway solution or the MX-less, there you're talking about, I think we're up to about 50 different engines and technologies that are part of that stack. And that's a very different sort of approach versus you get this stuff with the productivity suite. It's a really deep sort of analysis of any inbound communications. It's a very different way.
I dare say. It also strikes me that adding layers, but also maintaining simplicity, these are opposing forces.
Yep.
How do you reconcile this? How do you help customers reconcile this not a disconnect, but certainly a contradiction or a paradox? Yeah,
look, I agree. There's a tension there, and the way I kind of think about it is almost like on a spectrum where there is a sweet spot, and that sweet spot will depend on the organization. So, like I say, for some, the ability to do complex routing and address alteration and the sort of heavy lifting that a secure email gateway can do, that's appropriate. So that, sort of potential increase in complexity. And I said this before, like we're seeing a shift where for organizations that are looking for that simplicity, they'll put it back on the vendor. Like we've done this for 20 years, so we can make those decisions around, we have the tech stack already, but we can roll out global policies that can protect M365, Teams and Slack as we move into the future with a single policy. So the complexity goes away, but the security outcome remains. So you're reducing the risk, but without all the overhead operationally of managing a gateway platform.
Ger, it's been super interesting to sort of peel back the layers on this complexity. Really appreciate you stopping by the Dark Reading News Desk today. Thanks for joining us.
Great to speak to you. Thanks, Terry. We've
been talking with Ger O'Hara, Field CTO with Mimecast. This is Terry Sweeney with the Dark Reading News Desk at Black Hat.